This lecture on Nicomachean Ethics, Book 5, concerns the notion of justice. It consists of just 10 slides, but the notion of justice is rather complex in Aristotle. The basic idea of justice is lawfulness and fairness in social settings, as a virtue or excellence relating to ultimately relating to social decency. So the word social I just used twice in the same sentence, so this is focused on human interaction and lawfulness and fairness in human interaction. As for the notion of decency, we'll see something about that later, but I'll just tell you ahead of time that for Aristotle, decency is something greater than justice. Aristotle first divides the notion of justice into two kinds. The first is general justice, and that's the totality of virtue. Someone who's called just in this general way has all of the virtues, according to Aristotle. But that's not his main concern in this book. His main concern in this book is what he calls special justice, that is the more delimited sense of justice, the social virtue, which has as its ultimate end or purpose or goal decency in human interaction. Now, special justice is as a virtue is a state, not a capacity, and it relates to actions. So we've already seen this sort of thing too earlier, that virtue is a state and not a capacity. So he divides it into four kinds in his discussion: justice in distribution, justice in rectification, justice in exchange, and justice in the political realm, or political justice. What is justice in distribution? Aristotle thinks that there can be justice or fairness in the distribution of goods and services where that distribution is unequal. So it's possible for there to be justice in a set of circumstances in which two people receive unequal amounts of something. So take, for example, the notion of how much food someone should receive for their good health. In the case of a 6'10" basketball player, then that person will need more caloric intake to maintain good health than a 5'2" woman. And a 5'2" pregnant woman will need even more. So we don't say in this case that what's the right amount of food for each one is exactly the same in each case. Rather, the right amount of food is determined by the consideration of what the person needs for the sake of good health. So in this sense, distribution can be unequal and yet be just. We do this sort of thing too in families. It's not that all of the children receive exactly the same amount of family resources. Some children may need more than others. And so in those cases, perhaps more goes to the child that's less able to take care of him or herself, and less goes to the child who is able to flourish without needing so much. In each case, the child gets what it needs for flourishing and fulfilling themselves in life, but those amounts of attention or money or family resources are unequal. And so that's justice in distribution, each getting according to its own needs in order to fulfill itself. And I like that idea of the varying amounts of caloric intake needed by different people, because it gives you a sense of that each person needs different amounts for their good health. So fairness in social relations may mean an unequal distribution of goods and services. Second listed here is justice in rectification. Justice in rectification involves making something right. So I want to associate rectification with making right. So you have rect, right, and facio, the Latin facio, for making. So this is a making right. The simplest example I can find on this would be if you think about a car accident. The person who is at fault in a car accident has responsibility for making right the person's car which that human being hit. So in an accident, the person at fault, that person's insurance must pay for the rectification, that is the making right again or repair of the car. When I was a child, we played baseball, and we put a we hit a baseball through one of the neighbor's windows. We were responsible for making that right, that is, paying for the window to be replaced. And that's all it is. So there's no additional penalty for this, but rather rectification means just making something right, realizing you're responsible for making things right in a social context. So when we overstep something or we make some mistake, we need to make that right. So that's another sense of fairness in society. Justice in exchange. Justice in exchange involves the use of money. And so Aristotle had in mind the notion of the free exchange of money with a firm understanding of the values of things. What Aristotle did not understand was the importance of marketing and branding that, of course, we know about now. A pair of jeans may cost much, much more if they have a certain brand on them. They're a certain kind. Than another pair of jeans which has another label on it. So fashion and social desire and competition play in our modern society in ways that Aristotle didn't understand. On the other hand, we do look for fairness in our exchange of goods and services. So if someone works for us for a certain time, we arrange ahead of time to pay that person, and a fair wage is what's appropriate. Some years ago, my wife and I were using Marquette students to clean our house, and we paid those people fairly. We paid the students fairly. One woman worked for us for, I think it's almost 6 years. She was in the physical therapy program, and she wasn't a servant as such. She had a job to do. We paid her for a job, and we paid her fairly. And that's why she stayed on working for us when both my wife and I are working, and we need somebody to help out to clean the house. So the exchange was decided upon ahead of time, and we lived up to that exchange. So we tried to, in other words, we tried to pay for the cleaning. We tried to pay a fair wage. Justice in the political realm for Aristotle is quite different. So justice in the political realm for Aristotle concerns justice, or what's right and in society, and fairness in society, for the most part, among aristocratic males. So in Aristotle's time, aristocratic males controlled government and the decisions of government. And in that context, though, there were also discriminations. So it wasn't that everyone participated in government, but only those who were educated and aristocratic males. And I say males because even aristocratic females were not allowed to participate in this. Aristotle thought that women were not capable of participating in political justice, and so the women were excluded from it. Now, it's an interesting issue that we'll get into when we discuss the critique of Aristotle, but Aristotle had different classifications of human beings. Some people functioned as slaves. Some people had the mental capacity only to function as slaves, and that is to do what other people tell them to do. The children were in a lower state as well, but male children were more valuable than female children, and because they could grow up and participate in the political realm. But Aristotle thought that women were unable to participate in the political realm, and so they were excluded from consideration with regard to justice. Aristotle had the idea that that women are much more emotional than men, and he tied it with their female nature and the notion of menstruation. Menstruation was regarded as a wandering womb disease. That is, once a month, the women would become very emotional because the womb is wandering, as it were. Now, this was just Aristotle's interpretation and a false interpretation of the ability of women to function in political society. We'll get into this in much greater detail later on with regard to the critique of Aristotle. But his notion was that women were not fit to be involved in government, and so they were excluded. So this political justice that involved the exclusion of women, what is the goal or end of political justice? Well, clearly, It's justice in the polis or city-state, and so its goal is to bring about fairness in the context of the state. And that fairness did not involve everyone's participation in government or in political matters. So, second question here. Why are individuals tempted to be unjust? Well, Aristotle answers this simply by saying that there is so much at stake in this, and people have the opportunity to be offered bribes, and to offer and take bribes, that is. And given that so much finance and power is being used in behalf of the entire state, occasionally individuals would be tempted to use it for their own gain and not for the polis or the whole political state. The ideal of political justice is what's good for the whole city, but given that there is so much wealth and power attached to it, people could easily be swayed, or some people would be easily swayed to be concerned about what's good for themselves, and not what's good for the entire city-state. So again, coming back to the other question, who can participate in political justice? Only aristocratic males, for the most part. Some other citizens are allowed to participate on some occasions, depending on the nature of the government at the particular period during the life of Aristotle and that period in Greek thought. But in terms of the real participation in political justice, this was left for the rich males who were able to have the education required for it. Certainly, participation in political justice on the part of farmers and craftsmen and that sort of thing was not possible in the time of Aristotle, because they didn't have the education or the time for the involvement in this. So that's the basic notion of justice, but Aristotle has something else going on here as well, and he makes a distinction between two notions in Greek, and the notions are nomos and physis. Nomos means convention, and physis means nature. So the argument's made about justice. What is justice by nature? And so justice by nature is the way things ought to be, the way things are by nature, set up, such as the relationship between men and women, with men dominating. That was Aristotle's view. Now, another sense of justice is justice by law or convention. So here in the United States, the law and the convention is that we drive on the right-hand side of the road for the most part. However, in the case of Ireland and England and some other countries, then people drive on the left-hand side of the road, and that's by law or by customary law or convention. Now, justice by nature, well, these will be something that will flow from the very nature of human beings. So the question was, which is the real sense of justice? Justice by nature or justice by convention? And the question arose also, is there or is there not any kind of natural justice? And Aristotle looked into this quite a bit and tried to figure it out by looking at the stories that are told about various other cultures and the nature of the society set up in those cultures. One thing that was reported back to the Greeks from India was that Indians cook their dead. Now, this was misinterpreted to attribute a barbarian custom, truly barbarian custom to the Indians, namely eating dead people. But rather, they burnt the body as a matter of honor, burnt the body on a funeral pyre, and that was misinterpreted. But the Greeks still were wondering whether, in fact, what they had devised in their own culture was the real understanding of justice by nature, or was it the case there really was no such thing as justice by nature? Aristotle explores this in considerable detail, and it can be pretty confusing to read, because he seems to argue at length that there is no natural justice, that it's just fully a matter of convention. But the way to understand natural justice is to consider whether there's a notion of political fairness in every culture. If we look carefully, we'll find that in every culture there is a sense of political fairness, although it varies greatly from culture to culture, religion to religion, society to society. So natural justice is that there's a system of rules and laws and someone to enforce them and guide the community in them. And that's natural to every human community. There'll be someone who plays the role of leader and seeks out what's good and fair for the entire group. And so Aristotle ultimately argues that there is natural justice, but it takes a different look in different cultures and different religious contexts. And so the conception of justice that we have with our laws in the United States is not identical to English justice, nor is it identical exactly to justice as practiced in France or in Italy. So all of the various nations around the world and all the groupings of people do have a notion of fairness, and which they apply to their own societies, but it can vary widely. So yes, there is natural justice according to Aristotle, but it varies in the way it manifests itself in the different societies. So there is something natural to human beings, this natural social interaction, and justice, or the social virtue of justice, is found when in that natural interaction people aim for what is good for the whole. Of course, there are good political regimes and bad political regimes, and good leaders and bad leaders, corrupt leaders and leaders who are incorruptible. It varies a great deal. But in all human societies, there is a notion of fairness, laws, judges, and the enforcement of laws. And that's what Aristotle has in mind then. So natural justice should be understood to exist for all human beings as social animals, but that it varies from culture to culture. Now, justice and just action. What is a just action? Well, it's an action done in accordance with social fairness and lawfulness in society. And how does it relate to just character? Well, by doing just actions in a habitual way and intentionally, as we've already seen in our earlier discussions, we are then able to form a just character. And this just character requires that the actions we do be voluntary actions that involve knowledge of what we're doing. Notice these are all criteria that we discussed earlier with regard to the formation of virtue. Now, actions, we can make a distinction, as we did earlier, between the voluntary and the deliberate, because the deliberate means we took time to deliberate. You'll recall that I spoke earlier about the 5 criteria for moral responsibility. So there can be actions which are voluntary, namely up to us, not by force or coercion, and with knowledge of particulars. That's one sense of voluntary action, but for full moral responsibility we have to have those 3 and add to them deliberation and decision. Now, in the context of his discussion of justice and just action, Aristotle speaks very carefully about these matters and wants to distinguish the justice itself, or justice as a virtue, over and against just action. Remember that just action has to be made habitual for it to be indicative of just character. So that's what he's really trying to stress here. We have to be able to see that. All right, so another topic, Aristotle on agency. What is the self for Aristotle? Well, clearly Aristotle has a sense of the sense of the human being being an agent for him or herself. And so what is key to this? And he gets into a bit of a discussion of something that's similar to what we find in Plato, and the notion of whether it's better to do or to suffer injustice. It's a bit complicated what Aristotle gets into, but he's trying to figure out, with regard to the issue of agency, who is the real agent and what is the real self in a human being. Now, for Aristotle, the soul or life principle, remember we're already in the discussion in ethics about the notion of soul or life principle, and we said that virtues of character have to do with rational control over the emotive part of the self. Now, Aristotle raises the question of whether it's better to do or to suffer injustice. And certainly, it is in his argumentation, one has to look at it very carefully, but in his argumentation you can see that he's arguing that while most people think that it is always better to do injustice to another, because injustice often involves physical harm, and no one wants to be the victim of injustice, nevertheless, for Aristotle, this is not a bodily thing. That is, this is not a bodily thing with regard to the right actions that we do. That is, for Aristotle, if we choose to do a bad action, then that's an action that we've taken on and chosen for our own self. And so if we do harm to another person, the other person is physically harmed, but we ourselves are harmed with regard to our soul and the habits formed in the soul and the nature of our character. So on the question, is it better to do or to suffer injustice? For Aristotle, the answer is it's better to suffer injustice because you did not choose deliberately to administer an injustice to another person. The real self involved here that we have to preserve is the self that is the agent, the doer, that takes the action. And so for Aristotle, agency is tied up in the doer and the self, and the person who initiates unjust action does moral harm to him or herself. The person who is the victim has done no moral harm to anyone and remains innocent. This is not unlike our discussions in contemporary society with regard to sexual assault. The person who is sexually assaulted does not become a worse moral person for being a victim. The person who perpetrates the action does become a worse moral person. So which is better, to suffer or to do injustice? Certainly the person who suffers injustice, the person perhaps who is sexually assaulted, suffers more in body. But which is more important, body or soul? And we might say body or self, because the victim is completely innocent, but the perpetrator is the one who is harmed, and has harmed him or herself in the actions that they take against an innocent party. So Aristotle's arguing here that the real self is not our bodies, but that part of us which chooses action and is responsible for the choices of action, and that he calls the soul, the principle of movement within us. And we need to guard the actions of that soul so that we do not do immoral actions and do not make that a habit, because to do so is to make oneself vicious. So for Aristotle, which is the real self, body or soul? The real self is the soul. He raises then another question, which is a rather interesting one, and that is, can a person voluntarily suffer injustice? That is, can we choose in some voluntary way to suffer injustice? Now, in a sense, Aristotle rules out the possibility, because in fact justice is a social virtue and not just something that concerns a person and his or her own very self. So, properly speaking, justice and injustice is not a matter of an individual person. Rather, it has to have the social context. But the kind of thinking he's got in mind here is that of the incontinent person, the person who is weak and slips up and doesn't always do what's right. And in this case, Aristotle says that there is a sense in which we might want to think that the incontinent person, the person who slips up and doesn't do what's morally right, has voluntarily suffered injustice. Because the person who is very weak and tempted to steal and then does steal, it seems that that person has voluntarily stolen and done injustice to him or herself. In fact, that person has harmed his or her own character, but properly speaking, this shouldn't be called a matter of injustice, because injustice is a social virtue. Now, I said I'd get around to the notion of decency in Aristotle, and this is a very interesting notion that he has. Think of decency as something much more than justice. Justice aims at what is fair in social settings, but it's possible for us to go beyond what is fair for the sake of what's good for the entire society. So if someone needs to borrow money from you to pay rent or something, and says, I'll give you as collateral, I'll give you my stereo system as collateral, or my television, or something like that. So if I don't pay you back the money on the due date, you can have my television, which is worth much more than that money. Now, in that situation, if the person does not pay you back the money on the time that was agreed upon, you can insist upon getting what was agreed upon in writing, and that is the person's television or whatever material good that person offered. However, the decent person aims at what's good for everyone in the situation. So perhaps in this case, the decent person could wait a few more days to collect the money that was owed. And then things would work out better for everyone if the decent person is able to, as we might say, cut some slack to someone. So that's what Aristotle has in mind. The decent person is not a stickler for justice, doesn't insist upon the day is here, you must pay me now, or hand over the collateral. No, the person of decency wants to find a way to work things out for what's best for all the people involved, to the extent that that's possible. So Aristotle says this: it is clear from the discussion that he has what is decent, and clear that it is just. So whatever is decent is just, and better than a certain way of being just. Now that certain way of being just is to be a very stickler for the justice, to insist upon the precise words of the contract. And he goes on, it is also evident from this who the decent person is. So who is the decent person? He goes on, for he is the one who decides on and does such actions, not a stickler for justice in a bad way, in other words, absolutely holding on to the agreement, but taking less than he might, even though he has the law on his side. That's cutting someone slack of a few more days to pay back the debt before you seize the property that was put in collateral. He goes on to say that this is the decent person, and his state is decency. It is a sort of justice, and not some state different from it. So it's kind of justice, and it's not different from justice, but it's more than that, because it aims toward what's good for the entire society. So it's aiming at what will allow each to flourish. And if you can allow, the decent person can allow a little more slack to someone for the sake of a good outcome for everyone involved, that's a decent person. This is the kind of social interaction of a very positive kind that Aristotle thinks that justice should aim at, with decency being something even greater than justice. Now, a further question that Aristotle brings up here, and I already mentioned it a bit, but it's this issue of whether it's better to do or to suffer injustice. And we've already discussed this, so I won't go into it again here in any great detail. But again, to suffer injustice, I'll just simply repeat myself, to suffer injustice is not the same as to initiate it. The person who initiates injustice chooses to do it and makes the action and is fully responsible for initiating the action and following through on it. The person who suffers injustice, the person who is assaulted or beaten or something of that sort, or this person who is a victim of robbery of various kinds, maybe cybercrime victims, and are they better as moral persons or worse? They're less well off with regard to material goods and body, one might say. But the person who is worse off is the person who develops the habit of initiating injustice. That person then becomes vicious. And the person's, you might say, well, the person deserves to suffer. But in fact, Aristotle's notion here is that, in fact, the person who ends up suffering is the one who did the injustice. The person ends up suffering by developing a character in him or herself that would inflict injustice upon others, and thereby alienate him or herself from the notion of being a cooperative citizen, living in a good society and living a good life. That's the kind of thing Aristotle has in mind. So I think I'll stop right now for this video, and the next video we'll be looking at will be Book 7, And that's on the notion of incontinence, but I'll put that up a bit later. And there we are.